actually never heard your story. How did you get into Iraq to begin with?
So I, out of high school, went into the U.S. Army and redeployed, and I was serving in the northeast province of Saudi Arabia during the '91 Gulf War. And I was there for 8 months, and eventually ended up in Kuwait City shortly after it was freed. And I saw the human costs of the war, like, up close and personal. So that I carried that, and then I ended up doing human rights work, but eventually came back to Iraq because I felt like there was a need to undo the damage that had been done. Like, I was in a position as an American, a veteran of the Gulf War, to be able to speak about an issue that wasn't getting enough attention. And at that time it was sanctions. Iraq living under sanctions, a humanitarian crisis. There was essentially a media blackout. The New York Times totally ignored, the story. Washington was not looking at the issue at all. If Iraq came up, the conversation would begin and end with Saddam Hussein. Mm-hmm. And that was frustrating. So we established as an organization here in Washington, D.C., and we actually focused on Capitol Hill, on the administration, and trying to get them to care. And we actually were seeing progress, but then 9/11 really changed everything.
So how did you make that pivot? I mean, you're talking about you established the organization at a time when Saddam was the beginning and end of every story, mm-hmm. but now you're working with a generation of activists who don't even know who he is. We're not even born during his reign.
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting old. It's like the younger generation in Iraq gives me so much hope, and that's what motivates me. These are young Iraqis who took to the streets demanding their rights, with the Tishreen movement in October 2019 and continuing. These are young activists who are taking on enormous challenges like climate change, water scarcity, conservation issues around the environment. They're dealing with the violence of the militias. In that extraordinary environment, some of these organizations, some of these activists are still able to create change, and that's just so inspiring. So being an organization that can connect with them, support them, and even find ways where we can support them through our research, through advocacy, like making policy recommendations.
You know what I found so interesting about this generation of Iraqis who were basically born and raised after Saddam's time, mm-hmm. is they have realized that the government is not going to solve their problems, right? Mm-hmm. They've decided that they can't just rely on the government. They can't do what my parents did, and really what my generation did is just complain about the government, but not actually take action. What has EPIC done to help, these Iraqis take action?
So I have a fun story. So one of the recent projects we had was in Sinjar, and we worked with these organizations and these activists, providing them with support on how do you develop a communication strategy, how do you do advocacy, and coming up with a specific local problem that you want fixed. And so, a great example was this young woman, Tali, and her organization that helps people with disabilities. They were looking at this intersection in Sinjar where people were getting injured and killed. And, the government wasn't doing anything about it. And people kept, this intersection was very important because there was a government office where people were crossing over to get assistance or what other help that they needed. And so we worked with them, they identified the problem, and they came up with a solution, a crosswalk. We provided them the support to buy the white paint and paint the crosswalk. We then had them tell the story. They did a whole campaign in the area to raise awareness about driving safe and about this crosswalk. And I believe that crosswalk is saving lives to this day. And the local government, the best part of the story is because they told the story effectively through YouTube and communications, not only did they reach an international audience, they also reached public officials. And the local government now has officially recognized that as a crosswalk. And they're now talking about putting other crosswalks at other dangerous intersections.
I really love that story because it sort of takes a very specific problem creates a model for solving that problem that you can then use to, solve bigger problems. So where do you see this sort of training and support going? Like, what's the goal here?
It's starting to have conversations with other activists, other organizations about the problems that they're trying to address. We're in conversations with a couple organizations that are looking at water scarcity and not climate change the way we think of climate change, but much more specific, like the gas flaring and how it's poisoning the air and villages and children are getting sick.
I know that we are raising $20,000 in 20 days. We need to raise it by October 31st. So can you tell us what EPIC plans on doing with that money?
So I shared the story about Tali. We're talking about bringing in a new group of activists to go through the training program, provide them tools and communications and advocacy so that they can make a difference on the issues that they care about, that they're working on. And part of the focus this time is going to be thinking more in terms of the environment. Because Iraq is extremely vulnerable. It's one of the countries that's being impacted by climate change more than other places in the world. Crop failures, massive, water scarcity. And there are these activists and organizations that are working to make a difference, whether it's in Basra, whether it's in Sulaymaniyah, whether it's in Baghdad. So we're going to be building those relationships, going through the training program, and then finding ways where we can provide the support that these activists need to make a difference.